Hey everybody, Mr. Regan here, and today we're going to be looking to figure out what's going on with the space station and the pod collision and the forces that are involved that explain what's going on with our pod from time 1 to time 2 to time 3 to time 4. And we're going to be focusing specifically on that collision that occurred between 3 and 4 in our comic so that we can, as always, help Dr. Gonzalez and her ground team figure out what they need to do. And in this case, how they're going to be rescuing the pod and the station. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we're going to start by reviewing a few important things about the motion of the space pod and the station. And again, focusing on time 3 and 4 here. And we're going to be looking at how we're going to use our key concepts to explain what's happening not only during these lost moments, but also how those lost moments resulted in what we see here in time 4. So let's go ahead and begin reviewing. We know that both the pod and the station experienced velocity changes at different points in the timeline. The pod experienced some velocity changes early on because of the weight due to the asteroids. But we're not focusing on this time. We're going to be focusing on this time here. And we're going to be using our understanding of collision forces that we've looked at in our experiments and our readings to make inferences about what's happening to cause changes in the pod and station's velocity during time 3 and 4. So how did the collision in 3 and 4 cause the velocity changes we see in time 4? So this is what we're going to be focusing on for this portion. Now, let's take a look. We know that the space agency, so that's Dr. Gonzalez and her ground team, discovered that the space pod was more massive than normal and inferred that the thrusters only slowed the pod and that caused the collision. So we know that a collision, or we inferred that a collision occurred due to the mass of the pod and the thruster forces. And we also were able to infer, after our space agency discovered, that the space station is moving, and they inferred that it must have experienced a force, because we know that in order for an object to change its velocity, a force must be exerted and cause the velocity changes that we are observing here in time 4. So we have to figure out two important things in order to understand this cause and effects. This idea that this collision and the forces in this collision cause the change in velocities we see within time 4. So this cause with the collision and the effects of the change in velocity. And the two questions we're going to be looking to answer to explain this cause and effect relationship, we're going to be pulling in our key concepts. So let's take a look at these questions. The first one, what can you infer about the strength and direction of the forces experienced by the pod and the station when they collided? So in time 3, we're going to be looking at answering that question using a specific key concept. The other question we're going to be looking to answer to understand the effects is what can we infer about the direction the space station and pod are moving as a result of this collision? So we got to really think about the cause and effect between the collision and the change in velocity and use our key concepts to explain what's going on. So let's look at the very first part, the cause of the velocity changes, that collision. Again, the question we're looking to answer, what can you infer about the strength and the direction of the forces experienced by the pod and station when they collided? And you're going to be looking to answer this question. So when we look at our key concept, we know that when two objects collide, number one, a force is experienced on each object. So in this case, both of our objects had to have exerted a force on each other. We know the two forces are exerted in opposite directions. And we know that the exerted forces are the same strength. So looking at our question, we know that all these different parts connect with our key concepts. So the first part asks, what can we infer about the strength? Well, if we look at the part here that talks about the strength of a force when objects collide, we can infer what the strength of the force was during the collision. If we look over here, it asks about the strength and the direction. Well, looking at our key concept, when the two objects collide, we can infer about the direction based on what our key concept says. And last but not least, the forces experienced by the pod and the station. Well, we can again infer about the forces that were exerted on the objects based on the fact that we know that the velocity changed. So your job for this first part is to use our key concept to answer all of the different parts that we see in the question. So talking about the strength based on what we see in the key concept, talking about the direction and talking about what they experience for both the pod and the station. So that's how we're going to be using the key concept to explain the cause of the velocity change. If you'd like to pause the video and go and answer the question in the next set of tasks, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, let's go ahead and look at time number 4. In time number 4, we know that the object's velocity, both the pod and the station, changed. And the question we're looking to answer is, what can you infer about the velocity of the space station and pod as a result of the forces in the collision? Well, we have a key concept here that explains what happens when we apply different forces, to two objects with different masses. So, number 1, if the same strength force is exerted on two objects, but the objects have different masses, the object with less mass will have a greater change in velocity. So again, if you notice our question, what can you infer about the velocity? Well, if we look at the key concept here, the object with less mass will have a greater change in velocity. We can think what's going to happen to the velocity. What can we infer about the velocity of the space station and the pod? Well, we know that the objects have different masses, so that should help us understand what kind of velocity changes are going to occur as a result of the forces in the collision. So we know that the forces in the collision caused specific strength forces to be exerted on both objects. And we have to think about what those forces are. So looking at the question, what can you infer about the velocity of the space station and the pod as a result of the force in the collision? Your job is to answer the question, and at each point where you see the different highlighted sections, in italicized sections, and underlined sections, tries to pull in the key concepts to explain those ideas. So at this point, you should be able to go into task number 6 and look to answer the questions here using our key concepts for both question 1 and question 2. If you have specific questions or need help, please reach out. Otherwise, good luck.